The filthy truth about medieval love. When people imagine medieval love, they picture knights kneeling before noble ladies, roses exchanged in candlelit halls, and poetry whispered beneath stone arches. This image survives because it is beautiful, comforting, and completely misleading. The reality of love in the Middle Ages was far harsher, more transactional, and often deeply unpleasant. Love, as we understand it today, was not the foundation of relationships. Survival, lineage, property, and social control were. In medieval society, marriage was rarely about affection. It was a contract between families, not hearts. For nobles, marriage secured alliances, land, and political stability. For peasants, it meant combining labor, sharing rent, and producing children who could work the fields. Romantic feelings, if they existed, were considered dangerous distractions. A man was expected to marry when he could afford a household. A woman was expected to marry when her family decided it was time. Refusal was rarely an option. Consent, as a concept, was fragile at best. Church law technically required mutual agreement, but in practice, pressure from family, lords, or economic desperation made choice largely symbolic. Girls were often married in their early teens, sometimes younger, to men much older. Love was something that might develop later, if luck allowed. If it did not, endurance was praised as virtue. The church preached that love within marriage should be restrained. Sex was permitted, but only for procreation. Pleasure was suspicious. Desire was sinful. Manuals written by clergy instructed couples on which positions were acceptable, when intercourse was allowed, and which days were forbidden. Sex during holy days, fasts, pregnancy, or menstruation could be labeled sinful. Even married love was surrounded by guilt and fear. Outside marriage, things became even darker. Adultery was officially condemned but widely practiced, especially among the nobility. Men enjoyed far more freedom than women. A husband's infidelity might be ignored or laughed off, while a wife's affair could lead to public shaming, violence, or death. Love outside marriage was dangerous, especially for women who carried all the social risk and punishment. Prostitution was everywhere. Medieval cities regulated brothels openly, viewing them as a necessary evil to protect respectable women from male desire. Prostitutes lived hard, short lives, exposed to disease, violence, and public contempt. Love had nothing to do with it. Sex was currency, survival, and sometimes coercion. Moral outrage existed, but demand never disappeared. Then there was courtly love, often mistaken for medieval romance at its finest. In reality, it was a literary fantasy created by poets for elite audiences. It celebrated longing, distance, and suffering rather than real relationships. The beloved lady was usually married, untouchable, and idealized. Courtly love was not about happiness. It was about discipline, obsession, and emotional pain. It allowed nobles to romanticize desire without threatening actual social order. Marriage itself could be brutally unstable. Domestic violence was common and largely accepted. A husband had the right to discipline his wife as long as he did not kill her. Emotional cruelty was invisible. There was no concept of marital rape. Once married, a woman's body was considered her husband's property. Disease shaped love in terrifying ways. Sex could mean death. Plague, syphilis, and other infections spread easily, especially in crowded towns. Lovers could watch each other decay in days. There was no cure, little understanding, and endless fear. Physical intimacy carried real, visible consequences. Even expressions of affection were limited. Public displays of love were frowned upon. Letters were rare, literacy limited, and privacy scarce. Most people lived surrounded by others, slept in shared spaces, and had no room for emotional intimacy as we define it today. Yet, despite all this, love did exist, quietly, illegally, in stolen moments, whispered promises, and shared hardship. Some couples did grow fond of each other. Some marriages became partnerships. Some people risked everything for affection. But these stories survived not because they were common, but because they were rare. Medieval love was not gentle. It was shaped by hunger, fear, religion, and rigid hierarchy. It was often unequal, controlled, and painfully pragmatic. The idea that the Middle Ages were an age of romance says more about modern longing than medieval reality. Love back then was not about happiness. It was about endurance, and sometimes simply staying alive. Now, close your eyes. Let the electric hum of your modern room fade into the silence of stone. Let the artificial blue light of your screens dissolve into the flickering, fatty yellow glow of a tallow candle. We are drifting back, past the noise of the industrial age, past the powdered wigs of the Enlightenment, deep into the 12th century. The air here is different, heavier. Can you smell it? It is a complex perfume of wood smoke, damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the faint, sweet rot of rushes strewn across the floor to catch the scraps of dinner. It is the scent of a world without plumbing, yet teeming with life. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and a local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We are standing in the shadow of the rose, a symbol that means so many things to the people sleeping in this drafty keep. Passion, blood, secrecy, and the fleeting nature of beauty. The night is not silent here. Listen closely. You can hear the wind howling through the arrow loops, a sound like a distant, mournful flute. You hear the rustle of straw mattresses, great sacks stuffed with dried stalks that crackle like autumn leaves every time a sleeper turns. Privacy is a myth we have not yet invented. In this great hall, bodies are huddled together for warmth, a tangle of limbs and breath. The lord and lady might have a heavy curtain around their bed, but sound travels through velvet just as easily as it travels through time. Imagine you are a ghost in this room, watching the rise and fall of chests, the twitch of a dreaming hand. We often romanticize this era as the age of chivalry, a time when King Arthur's knights rode out to do good deeds and win fair maidens. But historians still argue whether chivalry was ever a real code of conduct or just a desperate attempt by the church to stop violent men from killing each other on the weekends. It is likely the latter. The men here are not Disney princes. They are warriors whose hands are calloused from gripping sword hilts, whose teeth are worn down by grit in the bread. Though, to be fair, having a full set of teeth past 40 is a status symbol in itself. And the women. They are not passive damsels in distress. They are the fortress managers, the weavers of alliances, often sharper and more ruthless than the men who claim to own them. Tonight, we begin a journey through the tangled sheets and broken vows of history. We will peel back the tapestry to see the stone wall behind it, cold, hard, and enduring. We are moving toward a world where a kiss is a legal seal and a marriage bed is a battlefield. The candlelight is dying down now, leaving only the embers in the central hearth, glowing like the eyes of a waking beast. In this darkness, the boundaries between the holy and the profane blur. A prayer is whispered in one corner, a lover's moan stifled in another. This is the filthy truth, the soil from which the rose grows. It is not clean, but it is undeniably real. As the smoke settles and the castle sleeps, we must prepare to witness the first and most crucial transaction of all, the signing of the contract. For before a hand can touch a cheek, a quill must touch parchment, and the price of a life must be calculated in gold, land, and blood. The sun rises over the castle walls, burning away the mist and the romantic shadows of the night, revealing the stark, unromantic business of the day. For in this era, the rising sun does not greet lovers entwined in spontaneous embrace, but rather illuminates the dust motes dancing above a heavy oak table where two men sit, not discussing poetry, but price. We enter the solar, the private chamber of the Lord, a room that smells of beeswax polish and dried lavender, a scent meant to mask the mustiness of stone, but which only adds a cloying sweetness to the heavy air of negotiation. Here, the true heart of medieval romance beats, and it sounds suspiciously like the clinking of coins and the aggressive rustling of parchment. If you listen closely, you will not hear the flutter of a heart, but the scratch of a quill dipped in oak gall ink, a dark, permanent fluid that binds lives together more securely than any vow whispered in the dark. Marriage is the primary engine of this society, yet it has almost nothing to do with the two people standing awkwardly in the corner, trying not to make eye contact. It is a merger, a corporate acquisition in tunics and hose. The fathers are the CEOs, and the children are the assets, their value determined not by the kindness of their souls or the symmetry of their faces, though those help, but by the acreage they inherit and the alliances they secure. Historians often debate the prevalence of love matches in this period, with some arguing that the peasantry had more freedom to choose than the nobility. But the consensus remains that for the upper crust, marrying for love was considered an act of selfish irresponsibility, akin to a modern CEO betting the company pension fund on a roulette wheel because they liked the color red. It was dangerous. It destabilized the carefully stacked deck of feudal power. So we watched the negotiation unfolds with the precision of a horse trade. The bride's father offers a dowry, a crucial pile of wealth that effectively buys her a place in her new family. This is not merely a gift. It is an indemnity policy, a bribe to the groom's family to take on the burden of another mouth to feed and another body to clothe. The dowry might include silver plates, heavy linens that took years to weave, a strip of forest where pigs can forage for acorns, or a strategic bridge that allows the groom's father to tax his neighbors. It is deeply unsexy stuff. Imagine trying to spark a romance when your value is being loudly calculated in terms of how many sheep you come with. It puts a distinct damper on the flirtation. The groom, often little more than a boy himself, stands by, perhaps scratching a flea bite under his velvet doublet, realizing that his freedom is being signed away in exchange for a parcel of marshland and a promised alliance against a rival duke. He looks at his future wife, who is staring at her shoes, and wonders if she likes hawking or if she has a terrible laugh, but he knows it does not matter. The contract is the thing. In many parts of Europe, this agreement is sealed not with a kiss, but with a handshake or a sip of wine. a moment of legal binding that precedes the church ceremony by months or even years. For the lower classes, the filthy truth is quite literally dusty. A peasant marriage might be sealed by a simple hand fasting, a binding of hands with a cord or a strip of cloth in the village square or the local tavern, witnessed by neighbors who are already calculating how this union affects the harvest. There is a harsh pragmatism here that we might find chilling. A peasant widow with a strong back and a functioning cow is a more desirable match than a beautiful maiden with nothing, because beauty cannot pull a plow, and beauty certainly cannot survive a famine. We see a father counting out coins for the merchant, a fine paid to the Lord for the privilege of marrying off his daughter, essentially compensating the Lord for the loss of her labor. It is a world where human beings are items on a ledger. Yet, we must be careful not to judge these parents too harshly through our modern lens. They do not hate their children. In a world where life expectancy hovers around 35, if you survive childhood, and where a bad harvest means starvation, placing a daughter in a wealthy household, or securing a son or wife with strong hips and a good inheritance is the profoundest act of love they can imagine. They are not crushing their children's dreams. They are ensuring their children's survival. Safety is the highest form of affection. Romance is a luxury for those who do not have to worry about where their next meal is coming from. As the quill scratches the final signature, a heavy silence falls. The wax is melted, a glob of red sealing the fate of the young couple. They are now bound. The girl may be 12, the boy 14. They are legally adults in the eyes of their world, expected to manage households, produce heirs, and navigate the treacherous waters of adulthood. Yet they are still children who might prefer playing with a ball to managing a fiefdom. The ink dries, shiny and black. The deal is done. There is a sense of relief in the room, a tension breaking, but it is the relief of a business concluded, not a joy shared. The fathers clap each other on the shoulder, calling for wine, their laughter booming off the stone walls, while the couple remains quiet, two small figures on a chessboard, moved by giant hands. They are now a unit, a one flesh, in the eyes of the law, even if they have never spoken a word to one another alone. The concept of getting to know your spouse is something that happens after the wedding, over decades, or perhaps never at all. You might spend your entire life sharing a bed with a stranger, united only by the shared project of keeping the family line alive. This is the bedrock of medieval society. Stability over sentiment, contract over chemistry. As the morning light strengthens, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor, we see that the foundation of the medieval home is not built on the shifting sands of emotion, but on the granite of property law. It is cold, hard, and durable. But even this rigid system has a supervisor, a watcher more powerful than any father or king. As the families move to the chapel to bless this transaction, they step out of the realm of the ledger and into the shadow of the cross. For if the father owns the body, the church claims the soul, and the priests have very specific, very intrusive ideas about what this newly signed couple is allowed to do with each other once the bedroom door is closed. The contract may be signed, but the policing of their intimacy is just beginning. We leave the solar where the ink of the contract is drying and step into the dim, echoing expanse of the chapel. The air here drops in temperature, a sudden chill that seeps through wool and linen to prick the skin. The smell changes instantly. Gone is the scent of beeswax and coin. Here, the air is thick with frankincense, a sharp, resinous smoke meant to carry prayers to heaven, but which hangs heavy in the rafters like a spiritual fog. It is a scent that commands silence. Stained glass filters the daylight into pools of blood, red and bruised purple on the flagstones. Here, waiting by the altar, stands the priest. He is not just a spiritual guide. He is the third participant in every medieval marriage, the invisible chaperone who will follow the couple from this altar all the way into the privacy of their bedchamber. If the fathers own the couple's political future, the church owns their bodies, their desires, and their deepest, most secret thoughts. The modern mind imagines the church was simply against sex, but the truth is more bureaucratic. The church was the medieval world's HR department for intimacy, obsessed with regulation, documentation, and compliance. As our young couple kneels on the hard stone, knees aching in a way that is supposed to be good for the soul, they are listening to a liturgy that frames their coming union, not as a celebration of love, but as a containment strategy for sin. St. Paul's words echo off the vaulting. It is better to marry than to burn. It is hardly a ringing endorsement. It sounds less like a blessing and more like a fire safety regulation. Marriage is presented as a medicine for the disease of lust, a necessary concession to human weakness. This is the filthy truth of the soul, the belief that desire itself, even for one's own spouse, is inherently suspect. The influential theologian Saint Jerome had famously argued that a man who loves his wife too ardently is an adulterer. Think about that for a moment. You could cheat on your wife, with your wife, by simply enjoying her company too much. The ideal Christian marriage was Josephite, chaste, spiritual, and entirely devoid of the messy, sweating reality of physical passion. But since most people were not saints, the church provided a rule book, a user's manual for the human body that was terrifyingly specific. Scholars today study the penitentials, the guidebooks written for priests to help them conduct confessions. Such books are fascinating and deeply bizarre. They reveal that the celibate clergy spent a staggering amount of time thinking about the mechanics of sex. A priest in the confessional would not just ask, "Did you sin?" He would ask, "In what position? At what time? With what intent?" The only acceptable position was the natural one, man on top, woman beneath, mirroring the hierarchy of God over man and man over woman. Anything else, side by side, standing up, or woman on top, was not just kinky. It was a subversion of the cosmic order, requiring penance on bread and water for days or years. The bedroom was not a playground. It was a minefield. And then there was the calendar. If you think modern scheduling is difficult, try navigating the medieval sexual calendar. The church developed a complex schedule of blackout dates that would make an airline jealous. Sex was forbidden during all major fasts, the 40 days of Lent, the weeks of Advent before Christmas, and often the weeks after Pentecost. It was forbidden on feast days, of which there were many. It was forbidden on Wednesdays, the day Judas betrayed Christ, Fridays, the day Christ died, and Sundays, the Lord's Day. It was strictly prohibited during a woman's impurity, meaning menstruation, pregnancy, and for 40 days after childbirth. If you actually do the math, and some frustrated historians have, you are left with roughly 1 day a week where intimacy was technically allowed, provided you didn't enjoy it too much. It turned the act of love into a high-stakes game of red light, green light. One can imagine a medieval husband and wife lying in the dark, mentally consulting the liturgical calendar, counting days since the last full moon, and debating whether the Feast of St. Swithin counts as a major or minor holiday, before simply rolling over and going to sleep to avoid eternal damnation. It is a miracle the population of Europe grew at all. This regulation created a profound psychological dissonance. Couples were told to be fruitful and multiply, yet the act required to do so was shrouded in shame. Imagine the guilt of a young wife who finds a moment of pleasure in her husband's arms, only to immediately fear she has tainted the child she might conceive. Medieval medical theory, often blending with theology, suggested that children born from sinful sex, sex during forbidden times, or sex that was too passionate, would be born with defects. A clubfoot, a cleft lip, or a sickly constitution was not seen as a genetic accident, but as visible proof of the parents' lack of restraint. The burden of this belief was crushing, especially for mothers who bore the guilt for every cough and fever their children suffered. Of course, historians still argue vigorously about how much ordinary people actually listen to this. It is one thing for a monk in a drafty cell to write a rule. It is another for a tired ploughman to follow it. Human nature is stubborn, and the drive for connection is powerful. It is likely that behind closed shutters, many couples simply ignored the more ridiculous rules, whispering their own apologies to God and getting on with their lives. But the fear remained. The church was the gatekeeper of heaven, and the priest held the keys. The confession box was the ultimate surveillance tool. To lie to the priest was to lie to God, so the intimate details of the marriage bed were dragged out into the cold light of the church, scrutinized, judged, and penanced. The atmosphere in the chapel shifts now. The ceremony is ending. The priest sprinkles holy water, cold drops landing on the couple's bowed heads. They are pronounced man and wife, joined by God, but separated by a wall of rules. They stand up, their knees cracking, the stiff fabric of their ceremonial clothes rustling in the quiet. They walk back down the aisle, not into a happily ever after, but into a life where the shadow of the cross falls across the pillow. The nobility, with their private chaplains and public piety, felt this pressure acutely. They had the time and the literacy to worry about their souls. But as we leave the stone walls of the castle and drift down the hill towards the thatched roofs and mud walls of the village, we find a different reality. Here, in the smoke-filled huts of the peasantry, the church's grip is still felt, but it contends with a force even more powerful than theology, survival. The peasant does not have the luxury of pondering the theological implications of a Wednesday embrace. For them, a partner is not a vessel of sin, but a second pair of hands to hold the plough. As the castle fades into the mist behind us, we descend into the mud to see what love looks like when it is stripped of gold, silk, and theological debate, and reduced to the raw, aching need to make it through the winter. The path from the castle to the village is not paved. It is a ribbon of beaten earth that turns to glue whenever the clouds open, which in this part of the world is nearly always. We leave behind the high stone walls and the suffocating incense of the chapel to descend into the smell of wet thatch, wood smoke, and the pungent, earthy aroma of manure. This is the scent of survival. Welcome to the peasant's world, where 90% of the population lives, loves, and dies, almost entirely invisible to the chroniclers writing the history books. If the castle was a theatre of rigid contracts and stifled desire, the village is a place of brutal, honest necessity. Here, love is not a game or a political maneuver. It is a piece of equipment as essential as a hoe or a scythe. We step into a typical home, a small dark structure built of wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with mud and straw. It is essentially a basket you live in. Inside, the air is thick and smoky because there is no chimney, just a hole in the roof that lets out some smoke and lets in all the rain. Your eyes water immediately. But as they adjust, you see them. A man and a woman, sitting on a bench near the central hearth. Let's call them John and Alice. They are not beautiful by the standards of the court. Their skin is weathered like old leather. Their hands are scarred and stained with soil, and they are likely missing a few teeth. But there is a solidity to them, a groundedness that the nervous, flighty nobles up the hill lack. They are eating pottage, a thick vegetable soup that has been simmering for days, dipping chunks of dark rye bread into the bowl they share. Sharing a bowl is the ultimate act of intimacy here. It says, I trust you not to take the last piece of bacon. In the peasant world, marriage operates on a different timeline than the nobility. Historians have long noted that while noble girls were married off in their early teens, peasants often married much later, usually in their mid-20s. Why? Because you could not marry until you had a way to feed a family. You needed a plot of land, a cottage, perhaps a few sheep. This meant that John and Alice had to work, save, and wait. This delay gave them something the nobles rarely had: a degree of choice. They likely grew up together, played in the same fields, and worked side by side at the harvest. Their courtship was not conducted through poetry, but through proximity. Love blossomed in the shared rhythm of the scythe, in the passing of a waterskin under the hot sun, in the knowing glance across a crowded tavern. It was a slow-growing root, not a sudden bloom. When they finally married, it was less likely to be a forced merger, and more likely to be a partnership of equals, or as close to equals as the medieval world allowed. A peasant wife was not a decorative object. She was a vital economic engine. She brewed the ale, spun the wool, tended the garden, milked the cows, and often worked in the fields during the harvest. If she died, the farm collapsed. John knows this. He does not look at Alice with the distant, idealized worship of a knight. He looks at her with the deep, terrified appreciation of a man who knows he would starve without her. This is the filthy truth of peasant love. It is pragmatic, gritty, and incredibly resilient. It is built on the sheer terror of a bad harvest. But do not mistake pragmatism for a lack of feeling. In the evenings, when the work is done, there is a tenderness here that is all the more poignant for its roughness. We see John carving a wooden spoon for Alice by the firelight, a small, useful gift that says, I care, more than 1,000 sonnets. We see Alice mending John's tunic, her fingers moving with practiced care over the worn wool. They sit close together, not just for affection, but for warmth. Fuel is expensive and body heat is free. But privacy is a fantasy. Look around the room. They are not alone. In the corner, behind a flimsy hurdle, sleeps the family cow. A few chickens are roosting in the rafters, occasionally shifting and sending down a feather or a dropping. If they have children, They are sleeping in the same bed, a large mattress stuffed with straw. Intimacy in a peasant household is a stealth mission. It happens in hushed tones, under heavy blankets, with the acute awareness that the entire household, animal and human, is listening. It lends a certain frantic, suppressed energy to their lovemaking. There is a running joke among social historians that the silent generation wasn't born in the 1920s, but in the 1020s, because nobody wanted to wake the grandmother sleeping 3 feet away. Yet, there is a freedom in this mud. The church cares less about them. The priest is likely a peasant himself, more concerned with his own crops than policing their positions. The king doesn't care who they marry, as long as the taxes are paid. They are beneath the notice of the great powers, and in that shadow, they find a space to be human. But we must not romanticize the hardship. Their love is tested by forces we can barely imagine. We watch them freeze in the winter, huddling together as the wind whistles through the cracks in the daub. We see the fear in their eyes when the summer rain doesn't stop, rotting the wheat in the fields. We see them burying children, a grief so common it is woven into the fabric of their lives, yet never loses its sting. The bond between John and Alice is forged in these fires. It is a camaraderie of survivors. When John falls ill with a fever, it is Alice who boils willow bark and sponges his forehead, not a physician. When Alice labors in childbirth, it is the village women who rush to her aid, forming a circle of support that no money can buy. Their relationship is a fortress against a hostile world. As the fire burns down to embers, casting long, flickering shadows on the mud walls, the cow shifts and lets out a low, sleepy huff, a reminder that nature is never far away. John reaches out and takes Alice's hand. His palm is rough, calloused, and dirty. Hers is the same. There is no magic here, no spell, no grand destiny. There is only the warmth of another hand in the dark. It is enough. It has to be enough. They close their eyes, drifting into a sleep that must recharge them for another day of backbreaking labor. Their love story will never be written down. No troubadour will sing of the time John fixed the roof before the storm came. No tapestry will depict Alice making a poultice for a bruised shin. But in the grand silence of history, this quiet, stubborn partnership is the bedrock upon which the entire civilization rests. It is the mud that holds the stones together. But while the peasants sleep the deep sleep of the exhausted, the world above them is restless. We must leave the warmth of the hut and the smell of the cow and float back up the hill towards the clinking of metal and the snorting of war horses. For while the peasant fights the earth for survival, the men in the castle are preparing to fight each other for glory. We are about to meet the knight, the poster boy of medieval romance, and strip away his shining armor to see the bruised and battered man beneath. We will discover that the code of chivalry, far from being a guide to romance, was often just a thin coat of paint over a profession of violence. The dawn is coming, and with it, the sound of a sword being sharpened, a sound that has very little to do with love. The sun has fully risen now, striking the stone of the castle courtyard with a blinding, indifferent brightness. We leave the quiet, smoky intimacy of the peasant hut and ascend back to the world of the elite. But we are not heading for the tapestry-hung solar or the perfumed garden. We are following the sharp metallic tang of blood and oil to the armory. Here stands the knight. Let us call him Sir Robert. If you have ever pictured a knight, you likely see a figure in gleaming silver, a paragon of virtue who spends his days rescuing damsels and his nights composing sonnets. But as we step closer to Robert, the glamour begins to flake away like rust. The air in the armory smells of stale sweat, leather, and horse manure. It is the locker room of the Middle Ages, but with higher stakes. Robert is not a fairy tale hero. He is a professional killer. This is the filthy truth that the songs conveniently forget. Knighthood was not a romantic calling. It was a job, and a brutally violent one at that. Robert is essentially a tank operator, but the tank is his own body, encased in 60 pounds of tempered steel. Watch as his squire helps him dress. It is a slow, claustrophobic process. First comes the padded gambeson, a thick, quilted jacket that smells of the last 3 battles because it is impossible to wash properly. Then comes the mail, thousands of riveted rings that hang heavy on the shoulders. Finally, the blade. The squire tightens straps and buckles with a foot braced against Robert's scarf. This is not a magical transformation. It is industrial assembly. Once the helmet is lowered, Robert's world shrinks to a thin horizontal slit. His breathing echoes in his own ears, loud and rasping. He is effectively blind to anything not directly in front of him, and he is rapidly overheating. The reality of wearing armor is that you are cooking in your own juices. Historical accounts of battles often mention knights dying not from sword strokes, but from heat stroke and suffocation, crushed in the press of bodies, trapped in their own iron shells. This is the man who is supposed to be the master of romance. The very idea of chivalry, that code of conduct we associate with politeness and door opening, was, in reality, a desperate attempt by the church and the nobility to keep men like Robert from destroying society. Historians still argue about how effective it actually was. The word chivalry comes from chevalier, merely meaning horseman. The original code had very little to do with women. It was a professional pact between warriors. Don't kill me when I surrender. Ransom me instead. It was a way to make war profitable rather than just genocidal. The romantic parts, the protection of the weak, the honoring of ladies, were bolted on later, mostly by poets who had never swung a sword in anger. Robert doesn't fight for love. He fights for loot. He is a younger son with no inheritance, which means if he wants land, a house, or a wife, he has to win them at the point of a lance. This brings us to the tournament, the great spectacle of medieval life. In movies, the tournament is a sporting event. In reality, it was a meat market mixed with a riot. We follow Robert as he rides out onto the field. The ground is churned into mud by hundreds of hooves. The noise is deafening, trumpets, shouting, the terrifying thunder of destriers, massive war horses bred to bite and kick. The tournament is where Robert goes to find a wife, but not by wooing her. He is looking for a prize. In the early Middle Ages, tournaments were sprawling, chaotic mock battles that roamed across the countryside. Knights would capture each other and demand ransom. If Robert knocks a wealthy rival off his horse, he takes the horse and the armor, or he demands a heavy bag of gold to give them back. If he wins enough gold, he becomes a catch. Up in the stands, the ladies watch. This is often depicted as a scene of breathless romance, with women swooning over their champions. But look closer. The ladies are judging the livestock. A knight who wins is a knight who can protect an estate and bring in revenue. A knight who loses is a liability, The lady's favor, that sleeve or scarf tied around a lance, is less a token of secret passion and more a corporate sponsorship. By wearing the colors of a powerful countess, Robert is signaling his political allegiance. He is wearing a logo. If he fights well, her family's prestige rises. If he dies, well, the scarf can be washed. There is a dark, unspoken tension in Robert's heart as he lowers his lance. He is terrified. Not of death, perhaps. He has made his peace with that. But of failure, of poverty. The knight who cannot afford his armor, his horse, and his squire is a hedge knight, a vagrant who wanders the roads engaging in banditry. The line between a noble hero and a highwayman is razor thin, often determined solely by the fullness of his purse. This anxiety kills romance. How can he truly love a woman when she represents his financial survival? He looks up at the gallery, not with longing, but with calculation. He needs an heiress. He needs a widow with a nice tract of forest. He is hunting. And what of the physical toll? The man inside the metal is a ruin. By the age of 30, Robert's joints are grinding from the weight of the steel. He likely has sustained multiple concussions, leaving him with ringing ears and a temper that snaps like a dry twig. His body is a map of violence, broken ribs that never set right, scar tissue that pulls tight in the cold, teeth loosened by the jarring impact of a lance strike. When he finally takes off the armor at night, he does not emerge as a smooth-skinned Adonis. He is bruised, chafed, and smells of the battlefield. The transition from warrior to lover is not easy. Men trained to shut down their empathy, to hack through limbs and trample bodies, cannot simply flip a switch and become gentle poets in the bedroom. Domestic violence in the knightly class was an open secret. The law allowed a husband to chastise his wife, a chilling euphemism for physical correction. The same hand that wielded the sword wielded the rod. While true affection could and did grow, it often had to navigate the minefield of the knight's trauma and his conditioned aggression. The damsel in distress was often in the most distress from the knight who saved her. Yet, as Robert charges, the mud flying, the crowd roaring, a strange alchemy happens. The violence is aestheticized, the blood is hidden by the armor, the screams are drowned by the trumpets. To the observer, it looks like glory. It looks like a painting. And this is where the lie takes root. We want Robert to be a hero because the alternative, that he is just a violent man in a shiny suit fighting for money, is too ugly to bear. We need the myth, and no one understood this need better than the people we are about to meet next. As the lance shatters with a sound like a thunderclap, sending splinters of ash wood spinning into the air, the brutal reality of the impact is instantly transformed into a story. We leave the sweating, bleeding knight, gasping for air in the mud, and turn our attention to the man standing safely on the sidelines, holding a lute instead of a sword. He is the spin doctor of the Middle Ages. He is the troubadour. He watches the violence and sees a stanza. He watches the greed and sees a quest. He is about to take this filthy, transactional, bloody world and weave it into the most enduring, misleading, and beautiful lie of all, the golden cage of courtly love. The dust of the tournament field settles, and the smell of blood and horse sweat fades, replaced by the scent of rose water and roasting meat. We have moved from the violence of the yard to the suffocating luxury of the great hall. Here, the torches flicker against tapestries depicting hunting scenes, and the air is thick with the murmur of the elite. In the center of this scene sits the man who makes sense of it all, the troubadour. He cradles a lute, its wood polished to a deep shine, his fingers dancing over gut strings to produce a sound that is delicate, plucking, and hypnotic. He is the medieval equivalent of a rock star, but his lyrics are not about rebellion. They are about submission. He sings of finamore, fine love, refined love, a love that burns but never consumes. We listen to his voice, high and clear, drifting up to the rafters. He sings of a lady who is beautiful, distant, and cruel. He sings of a knight who weeps, who wanders, who serves her every whim without hope of reward. It is incredibly moving. It is also, largely, a complete fabrication. This is the cage of courtly love, a gilded prison built of words, where desire is allowed to exist only as long as it remains unfulfilled. Historians and literary scholars have long debated whether courtly love was ever actually practiced or if it was merely a literary game. The consensus leans heavily toward the game. Think of it as a pressure valve for a society built on loveless, arranged marriages. We have already seen that the lord and lady at the head table are business partners, not soulmates. But the human heart is a stubborn organ. It craves connection, so the poets invented a safe space for passion, a fantasy world where love is not a contract, but a religion. In this world, the roles are reversed. In reality, the man owns the woman. In the song, the woman is the master, the domina, and the man is a vassal. He pledges fealty to her heart, just as he pledges fealty to his lord's land. It is a thrilling inversion of power, safe precisely because it is contained within a song. Look closely at the lady the troubadour is singing to. She sits beside her husband, the lord. She is wearing a headdress of silk and gold wire that frames her face like a holy icon. She does not smile. The code requires her to be haughty, to be the cruel fair. But behind that mask, what is she thinking? This performance is for her, but it is not about her. She is a prop. The troubadour praises her eyes, her neck, her hands, but he says nothing of her mind, her humor, or her skills at managing the castle accounts. She is flattened into an object of perfection, as unreachable as a star. This is the cruelty of the pedestal. To be worshipped is not the same as to be known. In fact, it is remarkably lonely. The filthy truth of courtly love is that it was fundamentally about adultery, yet it was an adultery that usually stopped short of the bedroom. It was the erotics of waiting. The knight in the song wants the lady, but he cannot have her because she is married to his boss. This triangle is essential. If the knight actually got the girl, the tension would vanish and the song would end. Therefore, the suffering is the point. The poets celebrated the sweet pain of desire, arguing that unfulfilled longing made a man nobler, braver, and more virtuous. It is a convenient philosophy for a world where acting on your feelings could get you executed for treason. But there is a cynical edge to this performance. Watch the husband, the lord. Why does he allow this poet to flirt openly with his wife in front of the entire court? Why isn't he reaching for his sword? Because having a wife who is praised by poets is a status symbol. It means he possesses a prize that others desire. It is a display of power. Look at this exquisite creature I own. His silence says, you may sing to her, you may weep for her, but at the end of the night, I am the one who holds the key to her chamber. The troubadour is not a threat. He is a part of the Lord's retinue, paid to make the Lord's court feel sophisticated and trendy. The songs of secret, stolen love are bought and paid for by the very men they are supposedly cuckolding. Occasionally, of course, the game turned real. We have historical records of troubadours who pushed the boundaries too far, who mistook the metaphor for an invitation. These stories rarely end well. Real adultery was not poetic. It was dangerous, messy, and treasonous. But for the most part, the cage of courtly love was a social safety mechanism. It allowed young, unmarried knights, who were effectively sexually frustrated warriors living in a brotherhood of violence, to channel their energy into harmless poetry, rather than assaulting the local populace or challenging their lords. It civilized them. It taught them to wash their hands, to speak softly, to appreciate music, and to view women as something other than broodmares or spoils of war. In that sense, it was a civilizing force, a veneer of politeness painted over the rough wood of feudalism. Yet, for the modern listener, the most disturbing part of this game is the silence of the woman. In the thousands of lines of courtly poetry, the lady rarely speaks. She is spoken to, she is looked at, she is begged, but she has no voice. She is a mirror reflecting the man's emotions back at him. Does she love him? Does she hate him? Is she just bored and thinking about whether the cook put too much saffron in the stew? We never know. The love celebrated here is entirely narcissistic. It is about how the man feels, how the man suffers, how the man is improved. The woman is merely the catalyst, necessary but interchangeable. The song draws to a close. The troubadour strikes a final melancholy chord that hangs in the smoke-filled air. The court applauds politely. The lady nods, a gracious, practiced movement that reveals nothing. The illusion holds. For a moment, everyone in the hall has pretended that love is a noble quest, that women are queens of the heart, and that desire is a spiritual journey. But as the applause fades, the reality of the room reasserts itself. The Lord stands up, signaling that the entertainment is over. He places a heavy hand on his wife's shoulder, possessive, guiding, absolute. The troubadour packs away his loot, his job done. He has spun the web, caught the size of the audience, and earned his coin. But the lady, she must now leave the hall and ascend the winding stone stairs to her true reality. The song is over, and the golden cage of poetry dissolves, leaving behind the iron bars of law. We follow her now, away from the admiring gazes, into the private darkness where she is not a goddess, but a chattel. The music fades, and the heavy wooden door slams shut, locking us in with the terrifying legal truth of what it meant to be a wife in the Middle Ages. The heavy oak door clicks shut, sealing out the music, the laughter, and the illusion. We are now in the lady's solar, a private room that should be a sanctuary, but tonight feels more like a cell lined with silk. The air here is still, smelling of dried lavender and the metallic tang of the charcoal brazier burning in the corner to ward off the damp. Watch as the lady stands before her polished steel mirror. Her ladies-in-waiting begin to dismantle the architecture of her appearance. They unpin the gold wire, remove the heavy headdress, and unlace the stiff bodice that has held her posture rigid for hours. As the layers of velvet and brocade fall away, so too does her power. Down in the hall, she was a goddess, the arbiter of chivalry. Here, in the eyes of the law, she is something far less profound. She is property. We have arrived at the filthy truth of medieval law. a system so rigid it makes the stone walls of the castle look flexible. The moment this woman said, "I do," at the altar, a legal portcullis slammed down, trapping her in a state known as coverture. In the eyes of the common law, a husband and wife were one person, and that person was the husband. She effectively ceased to exist as a legal individual. She could not own property. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue for damages. And she could not keep her own wages if she earned any. Her dowry, that vast wealth of land and silver her father paid, was instantly transferred to her husband's control. She is a ghost in her own house, possessing nothing but the jewelry on her neck, and even that, technically, belongs to him. This erasure extended to her very body. We often hear the grim joke about the rule of thumb, the idea that a man could beat his wife with a stick no wider than his thumb. While legal historians argue that this specific phrase might be a later invention, the reality it describes was terrifyingly accurate. A husband had the legal right to chastise his wife, just as he would a child or a servant. It was considered his duty. If she was disobedient, scolding was expected. If she was rebellious, physical correction was permitted, provided he did not kill her or permanently maim her. The line between discipline and abuse was invisible, drawn only by the conscience of the man holding the stick. The neighbors might gossip if the screams were too loud, but the sheriff would not come. What happened behind this door was private governance. But the most chilling chain was not made of iron. It was theological. It was the concept of the marital debt. The church taught that by marrying, a man and a woman gave their bodies to one another. This sounds reciprocal, and in theory it was. A wife could technically demand sex from her husband, just as he could from her. But in a world where men held all the physical and political power, the reality was deeply asymmetrical. A wife did not have the right to say no. Refusing her husband was not just a personal rejection. It was a sin, a breach of contract that endangered his soul by tempting him to seek release elsewhere. The concept of marital rape did not exist because legally, consent had been given once and for all at the altar. The bedroom was not a place of negotiation. It was a place of obligation. We must pause here to address one of the most persistent myths of this era, the chastity belt. You have likely seen them in museums or cartoons, metal contraptions designed to lock a woman's pelvis to ensure her fidelity while her husband was away at the Crusades. I want you to take that image and gently set it aside. It is a fake. Historians have found virtually no evidence that these devices were used in the Middle Ages. Most museum examples are forgeries from the 18th and 19th centuries, created by Victorians who had a strange fascination with medieval torture. The medieval man did not need a metal lock to control his wife. He had the law, the church, the servants, who acted as spies, and the crushing weight of social shame. He didn't need to lock her body because he had already locked her world. Yet, despite this suffocating legal reality, women were not broken. They were incredibly resilient strategists. We see the lady now, sitting by the fire, combing out her long hair. She knows her legal status, but she also knows her influence. If her husband wants his castle managed efficiently, if he wants his alliances maintained, if he wants his children raised to be powerful, he needs her. She is the chief operating officer of this estate. When he is away at war, which is often, she is the one holding the court, settling disputes, and organizing the defense. We have records of noble women who commanded garrisons and negotiated treaties. They found cracks in the iron wall of a coverture and pushed through them, wielding power through whisper, influence, and the sheer competence of their management. But tonight, the weight of the veil feels heavy. She hears the heavy tread of boots in the hallway. Her husband is coming. The troubadour's song of distance and longing feels like a cruel joke now. There is no distance here. There is only the proximity of the bed, the reality of the debt that must be paid. She stiffens, her face masking over with the same stoic resolve she wore in the great hall. She will endure. She will survive. She will do what is necessary to secure her position and protect her children. The door handle turns. The intimacy of the medieval marriage is not a retreat from the world. It is the final, most intimate outpost of the feudal system. But where does a man go when he wants to escape the heaviness of this duty? Where does he go when he wants a connection that is not about lineage, property, or legal obligation? He does not stay here. As the candle in the lady's chamber is blown out, plunging the room into darkness, we slip out through the keyhole, drifting away from the castle, down the winding streets of the town. We are following the scent of steam, wood smoke, and cheap perfume. We are heading to the one place in the medieval city where the rules of the church and the state are washed away by hot water and naked commerce. We are going to the stew houses, the public baths, where the filthy truth gets physically scrubbed clean, only to become morally murkier. The water is hot, the lights are low, and the company is available. The heavy wooden door of the castle is far behind us now, as is the cold, legalistic silence of the lady's chamber. We have descended into the labyrinth of the city, navigating narrow alleys where the upper stories of timber-framed houses lean in so close they nearly touch, blotting out the stars. We are following a different kind of warmth tonight. Not the dry heat of a hearth, but the wet, heavy, clinging heat of steam. We stop before a building marked with a painted sign, perhaps a boar's head or a cardinal's hat. The windows are shuttered, but light bleeds through the cracks, and the sound of splashing water and low laughter spills into the street. We push open the door and are instantly hit by a wall of humidity. Welcome to the stew house. We have arrived at one of the most misunderstood institutions of the Middle Ages. The popular myth, repeated in endless movies and bad history books, is that medieval people were universally filthy, that they bathed once a year if they were lucky, and walked around in a cloud of their own stench. This is simply not true. The filthy truth is that medieval people, especially in cities, were obsessed with cleanliness. They understood that dirt meant lice, and lice meant misery. Public bathhouses were ubiquitous in cities like London, Paris, and Nuremberg. But as we step through the steam, wiping the condensation from our eyes, we realize that this place is about much more than just soap and water. The atmosphere is thick, almost tropical. Large wooden tubs, big enough for 4 or 5 people, are lined up in rows or tucked into private alcoves separated by linen curtains. The water is hot, heated by great cauldrons in the back and scented with herbs, rosemary, thyme, and lavender, thrown in to sweeten the air. But underneath the herbs, there is the smell of wood rot, sweat, and wine. People are not just bathing here, they are socializing. We see a group of merchants in one tub, red-faced and laughing, a wooden board floating between them, holding a jug of ale and a plate of roast capon. This is the medieval spa day, a place to soak away the aches of a hard life. But look closer. The boundaries here are fluid, in a society strictly stratified by clothing, where you can tell a duke from a dustman by the cut of his wool. Nakedness is a great equalizer. Stripped of their doublets and hose, the merchant, the apprentice, and the knight look remarkably similar. The steam blurs the lines of class, and in that blur, other lines are crossed. The word stew is a double entendre. It refers to the stoves used to heat the water, but it also became slang for the brothels that often operated within these walls. The bathhouse was the epicenter of the medieval sex trade. It was the red light district of its day, but wetter. The women working here, often called bath attendants, might offer a back scrub that turned into something more illicit for a few extra coins. In London's Southwark district, these women were famously known as Winchester geese. It is a nickname dripping with medieval irony. They were called this because the land the brothel stood on was owned by the Bishop of Winchester. The church, which thundered against the sin of lust from the pulpit on Sunday, was quietly collecting the rent from the houses of sin on Monday. It was a pragmatic, if hypocritical, arrangement. The church viewed prostitution as a necessary evil, a sewer to carry away the waste of male lust so it wouldn't pollute respectable virgins. We watch a young man, perhaps a journeyman, escaping the watchful eye of his master, slide into a tub. He is nervous. He is not here just to get clean. A woman approaches, her hair wrapped in a towel, her expression weary but professional. The transaction that follows is ancient and transactional, stripped of the poetry of the court. There is no loot here, no talk of fine love. It is flesh and coin, exchanged in the haze of steam. But there is a danger here far greater than the risk of sin. The water in these tubs is not changed after every customer. It is warm, organic, and shared. In an age before germ theory, the bathhouse was a biological time bomb. We are sitting in a petri dish. While the heat feels soothing, it is also an ideal breeding ground for bacteria. Syphilis, the terrifying great pox, has not yet arrived in force. That nightmare will come with the Renaissance. But other contagions lurk. A man coughing in the corner, a skin lesion hidden by the water, the fleas hopping from a pile of discarded clothes. These are the silent companions of the bath. The tragedy of the medieval bathhouse is that the very attempt to be clean often led to sickness. It was a game of Russian roulette played with hygiene. Yet, despite the crime and the danger, there is a strange, undeniable intimacy here. For the poor, who lived in drafty, unheated hovels, the bathhouse was the only place they could be truly warm. It was a sensory escape. Imagine the feeling of hot water on a back stiff from 12 hours of lifting grain sacks. Imagine the luxury of being naked without freezing. For a brief hour, life was soft. We see a couple in a corner tub, not a prostitute and a client, but a husband and wife who have saved their pennies for a treat. They are washing each other's backs, speaking in low tones. In a world of hard labor, this hot water is a rare tenderness. It is a reminder that the desire for comfort, for the easing of burdens, is as much a part of love as any grand gesture. The church, however, was never comfortable with this. Preachers railed against the stews as vestibules of hell. They warned that the mixing of sexes in the water led to moral decay, and they weren't entirely wrong about the reputation. By the later Middle Ages As fears of the plague and later syphilis grew, the voices condemning the baths became louder. The golden age of the public bath would eventually end, shuttered by a combination of Puritanism and panic, leaving Europe smellier and more repressed for centuries to come. But for now, the steam still rises. The laughter echoes off the wet tiles. The water sloshes against the wood. We sit for a moment longer in this humid twilight, watching the shapes of human bodies moving in the mist, vulnerable, exposed, seeking pleasure in a world that offers little of it. It is a scene of profound humanity, messy and morally grey. The bathhouse is neither a temple nor a pit. It is simply a place where people come to wash off the dust of the road and the guilt of their lives, if only for an hour. As we step out of the bathhouse, the contrast is physically shocking. The night air hits us like a slap, instantly turning the moisture on our skin to ice. The smell of steam is replaced by the sharper, colder scents of the street, charcoal, manure, and the salt of the nearby river. We are clean in a way, but we carry the secret knowledge of what happens in the dark. The city is waking up now. The sun is beginning to bleach the sky, turning the dark blue to a pale, sickly grey. The time for secrets is ending. The time for commerce is beginning. We must leave the shadows of the stews and move into the open, crowded light of the square. For while the knights have their tournaments and the sinners have their baths, the vast majority of love stories happen in the most mundane place of all, the market. It is here, among the cabbage stalls and the fishmongers, that we will see how ordinary people stole moments of privacy in a world that never stopped watching. The sun has vaulted over the city walls now, and the grey light has hardened into the blinding, busy glare of mid-morning. We leave the steamy shadows of the bathhouse and step into the sonic blast of the marketplace. If the castle was the head of the medieval body and the church was the soul, this is the stomach, rumbling, hungry, and unapologetically loud. The air here is a physical force, a riotous blend of unwashed wool, roasting pig, saltwater fish beginning to turn in the heat, and the sharp, nose-wrinkling tang of the tanner's stalls. Close your eyes for a second and just listen. It is a wall of sound, the screech of iron wheels on cobblestones, the aggressive haggling of merchants, the squawking of doomed chickens, and the constant rhythmic ringing of the blacksmith's hammer. This is where the ordinary people live their lives. And crucially for our story, this is where they fall in love. In a world without dating apps, nightclubs, or private living rooms, the market is the primary venue for courtship. But it is a courtship conducted under the highest security conditions imaginable. We tend to think of privacy as a basic human right. But in the Middle Ages, privacy was viewed with deep suspicion. To be alone was to be up to no good. A closed door meant conspiracy or sin. So for the vast majority of the population, apprentices, servants, daughters of tradesmen, romance had to happen here, in the open, surrounded by 500 witnesses. Watch a young woman at the ribbon stall. Let's call her Agnes. She is wearing a simple linen coif to cover her hair, because a loose-haired woman is considered available in a way she cannot afford to be. She is ostensibly here to buy a blue ribbon for her mistress, but her eyes are not on the merchandise. They are darting sideways, scanning the crowd. She is looking for Thomas, a carpenter's apprentice she saw at Mass last Sunday. When she spots him, there is no running into his arms. That would be social suicide. Instead, we witness the delicate, high-stakes art of the stolen glance. It is a microscopic theater of desire. Thomas moves to the stall next to hers, pretending to examine a set of iron nails. He doesn't look at her directly. That would be bold, bordering on aggressive. Instead, he speaks a little too loudly to the merchant, ensuring she hears his voice. Agnes, in turn, drops a coin. It is a calculated clumsiness. As she bends to retrieve it, and he bends to help, their hands brush for a fraction of a second in the dirty straw of the street. That electric jolt of contact has to sustain them for weeks. In a world of heavy wool and strict social distance, the brush of a fingertip is as explosive as a modern kiss. This is the filthy truth of public love. It relies on plausibility. You must always have an excuse. You are not flirting. You are haggling over the price of turnips. You are not following him. You are just going to the same well for water. This necessity for deception creates a strange dynamic where romance looks a lot like commerce. The language of love is hidden inside the language of trade. This fabric is too rough, she might say, looking him in the eye, a coded challenge that has nothing to do with the cloth. I can smooth it for you, he might reply, a promise that has nothing to do with ironing. But Agnes and Thomas are not alone in this dance. They are being watched. See those three older women sitting on the bench by the fountain, spinning wool on drop spindles. They look harmless, like the medieval equivalent of a knitting circle. They are not. They are the surveillance state. In Old English, the word for a close female friend was godsib, literally god-sibling or godparent. Over time, this word evolved into gossip. These women are the keepers of the community's moral ledger. They know whose daughter was seen talking to the miller's son for too long. They know whose wife bought an extra loaf of bread when her husband was away. In a society without a police force, gossip was the primary weapon of social control. If Agnes is seen laughing too freely with Thomas, the gossip network will transmit this data back to her father before she even gets home with the ribbon. The consequences are real. A woman's reputation was her credit rating. If she was labeled loose or light, her value on the marriage market crashed to zero. She could be publicly shamed, perhaps even forced to do penance in the church square. So, the courtship in the market is a performance of indifference. Agnes must look bored while her heart is hammering against her ribs. She must look chaste while her mind is racing. There is a scholarly debate about how much agency young people actually had in these public spaces. Some historians argue that the market flirtation was a safety valve, a way for youth to select their own partners before the parents got involved to sign the contracts. If Thomas and Agnes like each other, they might convince their parents to open negotiations. The stolen glance is the first step in a very long, very bureaucratic process. It is the pre-interview before the job application. But what happens when the market is too crowded? What happens when the eyes of the godsibs are too sharp? We see couples seeking out the marginal spaces, the darker alleyways behind the tanneries, the shadow of the city wall, the hayloft in a busy stable. These places smell of rot and urine, but to a desperate couple, they smell like freedom. We catch a glimpse of a couple slipping into the darkness of an archway. They have perhaps 3 minutes before someone comes along. The urgency is frantic. Clothes are not removed. Too much time, too much cold, but simply adjusted. It is fumbling, terrifying, and adrenaline-fueled. This is not the slow, languid lovemaking of the movies. This is love on the run. Yet for many, even this risky contact is impossible. Maybe Thomas is shy. Maybe Agnes is too closely guarded. Maybe the person you desire does not desire you back. In a world where you cannot simply swipe right, where rejection is public and humiliating, where do you turn when natural methods fail? You don't give up. You turn to the supernatural. As the market day winds down and the shadows lengthen across the cobblestones, the nature of the commerce changes. The reputable merchants selling wool and grain begin to pack up, and from the shadows emerge the others, the peddlers of secrets, the old woman selling dried herbs in a pouch that smells of musk and decay, the man with a tray of amulets carved from bone. We are moving from the rationality of the contract to the desperation of the charm. Agnes has not managed to speak to Thomas today. The wall of gossip was too high. She feels the panic of a love that is going nowhere. She lingers at a stall near the edge of the square, where an old woman is selling medicines. Agnes isn't sick, at least not in her body. She glances around to make sure the godsibs are gone, then leans in close. She doesn't want a ribbon anymore. She wants a solution. She wants something that can bypass the laws of the church, the will of her father, and the hesitation of her beloved. She is about to step into the dark, weird world of medieval magic, where the line between a prayer, a recipe, and a spell is terrifyingly thin. She reaches for her coin purse, her hand trembling. She is buying hope, but she might be buying poison. The sun dips lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the market square, turning the cheerful bustle into something more secretive. We stand with Agnes at the edge of the crowd, huddled before a stall that smells of earth, dried mushrooms, and something faintly metallic. The woman behind the counter is not a witch in a pointed hat. She looks like a grandmother, her face a map of wrinkles, her hands stained with berry juice. But the business here is not baking pies. It is the desperate, dangerous industry of coercion. Agnes is here because she has run out of options. The church offers her prayer. The law offers her obedience, but neither offers her Thomas. So she turns to the only power left, magic. We have arrived at the filthy truth of medieval romance in its most literal sense. When we think of love potions today, we imagine sparkling pink liquids in crystal vials that smell of strawberries. Erase that image. Medieval love magic was visceral, biological, and frequently disgusting. It operated on the principle of sympathetic magic, the idea that you could bind someone to you by feeding them a piece of yourself. The ingredients were not rose petals. They were sweat, hair, menstrual blood, and urine. Agnes is clutching a coin, eyeing a small, dubious packet. The wise woman leans in, whispering a recipe that would make a modern health inspector faint. A common instruction was for a woman to strip naked, cover herself in honey and grain, roll around until the grain stuck to her sweat, then bake that grain into a loaf of bread and feed it to the unsuspecting object of her affection. The logic was simple. If he eats your sweat, he consumes your essence, and he will hunger for you. It brings a whole new, horrifying meaning to the phrase, bun in the oven. Other recipes were even darker. They involved grinding up worms, the hearts of doves, because doves mate for life, or the root of the mandrake, a plant said to scream when pulled from the earth. Some potions used cantharides, or Spanish fly, a beetle that, when crushed and ingested, irritates the urinary tract, causing a sensation that could be mistaken for arousal, provided it didn't kill the victim first. This is the terrifying reality of the love potion. It was often indistinguishable from poison. There are court records of women on trial, not for witchcraft, but for murder, after accidentally stopping their husband's heart while trying to start his libido. Historians debate how much people truly believed in the magical efficacy versus the chemical one. Did they think the spell worked because of demons, or because the herbs were actually drugs? It was likely a blur of both, but the demand was insatiable. In a world where you had zero control over your destiny, where a father's handshake could sell you to a stranger, a potion felt like a lever you could pull. It was an act of rebellion. Agnes isn't just buying a spell, she is trying to hack the system. But the magic of the Middle Ages wasn't just about creating desire, it was also weaponized to destroy it. If the love potion was the offensive weapon, the knot was the defensive nuke. We speak of the ligature, or knot magic. It was widely believed that a jealous ex-lover or a rejected witch could curse a man with impotence simply by tying a knot in a piece of cord while muttering his name. This was a source of profound existential terror for medieval men. The fear of the knot reveals the fragile nature of medieval masculinity. A man's power, his lineage, and his legal standing depended on his ability to perform in the bedroom. If he failed, it wasn't just embarrassing. It was a legal grounds for annulment. Church courts actually heard cases where wives sued for divorce on the grounds of frigidity. The resulting trials were humiliating public spectacles where honest women were appointed to inspect the husband's equipment to verify if the wand was truly broken or if he just didn't like his wife. In this high-pressure environment, it was much easier for a man to claim, "I'm not impotent, I'm bewitched." It shifted the blame from his body to a malicious third party. So, the market for counterspells was just as booming as the market for love potions. Men bought amulets of badger teeth or carried sprigs of St. John's wort to ward off the ligature. The bedroom was not a safe haven. It was a spiritual battleground where invisible forces were constantly tugging at the sheets. Agnes makes her choice. She buys a small bag of dried powder, perhaps verbena, perhaps ground bone. She hides it quickly in her sleeve. She is terrified. If the priest knew, she would be penanced. If the town knew, she might be branded a witch. But the fear of a loveless life is stronger than the fear of hell. She hurries away, her heart pounding, planning how she will slip this powder into Thomas's ale at the harvest festival. There is a tragic irony here. The powder is likely useless, dust and weeds. But the placebo effect is powerful. If Agnes believes she has charmed Thomas, she might act with more confidence. She might look him in the eye, laugh at his jokes, and touch his arm. And that confidence, not the groundworms, might be the thing that actually wins him. Magic, in the end, is often just permission to be bold. As Agnes disappears into the crowd, clutching her secret hope, the sun begins to set in earnest. The market stalls are boarded up. The peasants retreat to their huts, and the town gates are barred. But high above the city, in the royal castle, the lights are just coming on. The game of love is played there too, but the stakes are not a carpenter's affection or a loaf of sweaty bread. The stakes are duchies, armies, and the fate of nations. We leave the dusty magic of the street to witness the glittering, deadly magic of the court. We are going to meet the king, but more importantly, we are going to meet the woman who actually holds his attention. She is not his wife. She is the mistress, and she is about to show us that in the Game of Thrones, love is the most dangerous weapon of all. We leave the smell of the market, the herbs, the sweat, and the desperate magic, and ascend the winding stone stairs to the very highest tower of the keep. The air here is different. It is rarefied, cooler, and scented with expensive perfumes imported from the east: ambergris, musk, and rose oil. We are entering the king's solar, the private heart of the realm. But we are not here to visit the queen. She is asleep in her own chambers, surrounded by her ladies, her duty to the succession fulfilled or waiting for the next moon. Tonight, we are visiting the person who often holds the king's actual heart, and frequently his ear, the royal mistress. This is the king's open secret. In the modern world, a leader's affair is a scandal that topples governments. In the medieval world, it was often a recognized, almost bureaucratic institution. For a powerful king, having a mistress was not a source of shame. It was a status symbol, a visible proof of his virility and vitality. If the queen represented the state, rigid, contractual, and bound by duty, the mistress represented the man, passionate, choosing, and alive. We find them in a room draped in heavy tapestries that muffle the outside world. The king is stripped of his crown and his heavy robes of state. Here, he is just a man, perhaps weary, perhaps aging, seeking a comfort that his political marriage cannot provide. And there she is. Let us call her Lady Catherine. She is not a secret kept in the dark. The entire court knows who she is. She likely has her own apartments, her own servants, and a budget that rivals a small duchy. She appears at court functions, often dressed more magnificently than the queen. But do not mistake this for a fairy tale romance. This is the filthy truth of high-stakes adultery. Being a royal mistress was a job, and it was one of the most dangerous professions in the Middle Ages. Catherine is not just a lover. She is a prime minister of intimacy. She has to be everything the queen is not. The queen can be dull. The queen can be pious. The queen can have a headache. The queen is safe because her position is anointed by God and sealed by treaty. Catherine has no such safety. She must be perpetually fascinating, endlessly available, and shrewdly intelligent. If she bores the king for even one evening, she loses everything. Historians often debate the level of political power these women wielded. While they had no official office, their influence was terrifyingly real. In the intimacy of the bedchamber, when the guards are outside and the advisors are asleep, Catherine can whisper a name into the king's ear. "My cousin needs a bishopric," she might murmur. "That duke is plotting against you," she might suggest. Access to the king's body meant access to the king's will. This pillow talk shaped history. Wars were delayed, alliances broken, and fortunes made, all because of a conversation that happened by candlelight between the sheets. Yet, consider the sheer exhaustion of her position. She is surrounded by enemies. The queen likely hates her, not necessarily out of romantic jealousy. Remember, the queen's marriage is a business merger, but because the mistress siphons off resources and influence that should belong to the queen's children. The nobles hate her because she is a gatekeeper. They have to bribe her to get to the king. The church hates her because she is a living symbol of sin. Catherine walks a tightrope over a pit of vipers, smiling the entire time. The dynamic between the king and his mistress also reveals the profound loneliness of the crown. A king is a semi-divine figure, separated from other humans by the terrifying weight of his power. He cannot have friends, only subjects. But with a mistress, especially one who is not a foreign princess, but a member of the local nobility, he can touch the ground. She is his connection to humanity. She is the only person who can see him naked, both physically and emotionally, without the armor of sovereignty. In this sense, the filthy, illicit relationship is often the most honest one in the castle. But it is a relationship built on a fundamental imbalance. The king loves her, perhaps, but he owns her. If she displeases him, she cannot simply break up with him. She can be banished to a convent, stripped of her lands, or worse. We recall stories of mistresses who fell from grace and found themselves destitute overnight, their jewelry reclaimed, their names erased from the guest lists, or consider the grim fate of those who got too involved in politics. When the king died, his protection evaporated instantly. A mistress who outlived her king was often the first target of the new regime's vengeance. She was the scapegoat for all the old king's mistakes. There is a cold pragmatism, even in the passion. Watch as Catherine accepts a necklace from the king. It is heavy gold, set with rubies. She kisses him, her gratitude effusive, but part of her is calculating the resale value. She knows this cannot last. She is gathering acorns for the winter. She is securing titles for her children, grants of land for her father, and a retirement plan for herself. It is romantic, yes, but it is also mercenary. It has to be. The queen, down the hall, is aware of all this. Surprisingly, history shows us that many queens tolerated the mistress. Why? Because a king with a steady mistress is a stable king. It is better he spends his nights with one woman the queen knows and can monitor, rather than running wild in the city or, heaven forbid, falling in love with a foreign rival. There was often a bizarre, icy détente between the two women. They were colleagues in the business of managing the king's ego. As the fire in the solar burns down to embers, the king falls asleep, his heavy breathing filling the room. Catherine remains awake. She stares at the ceiling, the velvet canopy of the bed looming like a dark cloud. She is the most envied woman in the kingdom, yet she is arguably the least free. She is a prisoner of her own beauty and the king's desire. She knows that time is her enemy. Every gray hair, every wrinkle is a threat to her survival. She is fighting a war against aging in an era with no plastic surgery, only lead-based powders that slowly poison the skin they are meant to beautify. The glamour of the court, the feasts, the hunts, the silks, masks a brutality that is just as sharp as the knight's sword. Here, people are used up and discarded. Love is a currency, spent to buy loyalty or pleasure, and when the coin is spent, it is worthless. But as Catherine watches the king sleep, she is unaware that a new visitor is approaching the castle. This visitor does not care about rank or beauty or political influence. It does not care if you are a king, a queen, a mistress, or a peasant. It cannot be bribed, and it cannot be seduced. It is coming from the ships docked in the harbor, carried in the blood of fleas on the backs of rats. It is about to make all these petty squabbles about lineage and adultery irrelevant. The wind outside changes direction, blowing from the east. It carries a scent that will soon overpower the rosewater and the musk, a scent of sweet, cloying decay. The golden age of medieval population growth is over. The filthy truth is about to become literal. The great mortality is coming. As the candle flickers and dies, plunging the lovers into darkness, we prepare to witness the greatest test of love in human history. How do you love someone when their touch means death? How do you hold a hand that is turning black? We are moving from the intrigue of the court to the horror of the sickbed. The plague has arrived. The heavy velvet curtains of the royal solar are drawn, but they cannot shut out what is happening in the streets below. The wind has shifted. It is no longer carrying the salt of the sea or the smoke of the hearth. It carries a silence, a terrifying, heavy silence that sits on the chest like a stone. We have arrived at the year 1347, or perhaps 1348. The dates blur because time itself seems to be collapsing. The great mortality, what we now call the Black Death, has docked in the harbors, carried in the bellies of fleas, nestled in the fur of black rats. It is about to rewrite every rule of medieval society. But most devastatingly, it will rewrite the rules of love. We leave the castle, which is now locked tight, the drawbridge raised in a futile attempt to quarantine the nobility from the will of God. We drift down into the town, where the narrow streets, once noisy with commerce and flirtation, are empty. Grass is beginning to grow between the cobblestones. The doors of the houses are marked, some with red crosses, others simply left swinging open on their hinges, creaking in the wind. There is no one left to close them. We enter a house. It is the home of a merchant, a place that was once filled with the warmth of family dinners and the security of accumulated wealth. Now the air is thick with a smell that defies description, a cloying, sweet, sickly odor of decay mixed with vinegar and burning aromatic herbs, the desperate, ineffective air fresheners of the apocalypse. In the bedroom, a scene is unfolding that is the ultimate test of human connection. A husband stands by the bedside of his wife. The filthy truth of love has never been more literal. The plague is a disease of fluids, of swellings, of bodily betrayal. The woman on the bed is feverish, her skin burning to the touch. Under her arms and in her groin, black swellings, buboes, the size of apples have appeared. They are agonizing. She is delirious, thrashing in the sheets. And here is the choice, the terrible, binary choice that defines this era. To love is to stay. To survive is to run. Medical knowledge of the time claimed that the disease was spread by miasma, or bad air, but also by the gaze of the sick, or their breath. People believed that to simply look into the eyes of a dying person was to invite the sickness into your own soul. To touch them was a death sentence. And yet, look at the husband. He is not running. He is holding a cloth soaked in rosewater to her forehead. He is leaning in to hear her whispered prayers. He is breaking the most primal instinct of all, self-preservation, for the sake of a bond that is supposed to be until death do us part. Historical accounts, most famously by the Italian writer Boccaccio, paint a bleak picture of this time. He wrote of fathers abandoning sons, of wives leaving husbands, of a total collapse of human empathy, where everyone was dead to everyone else, and this certainly happened. Panic is a powerful solvent. It dissolves social glue instantly. But historians today argue that Boccaccio was writing a satire, or at least an exaggeration, to critique society. Court rolls and wills from the period tell a different, quieter story. They tell of spouses who died days apart, clearly having refused to leave each other's side. They tell of parents found dead in the same bed as their children. This is the heroic, tragic side of medieval love that the romances rarely touch. It is not about fighting a dragon. It is about washing a feverish body when you know the very water might kill you. It is about sitting in the dark, listening to the labored breathing of your beloved, waiting for the silence. It is love, stripped of all vanity, all transaction, all hope of future gain. It is love as a pure, sacrificial act of witnessing. But outside this room, the structures that supported love are crumbling. The church, the great regulator of life and death, is failing. The priests are dying faster than anyone else because they are the ones leaning in to hear final confessions. The result is a spiritual panic. The dying are terrified they will pass without the last rites, doomed to wander purgatory. So, the Pope grants a frantic, unprecedented dispensation. People can confess their sins to anyone, even to a woman. Think about the intimacy of that. A husband confessing his deepest shames to his wife as he dies. A wife whispering her secrets to her sister. The hierarchy of the church dissolves, leaving only two people in a room, stripping their souls bare before the end. It created a strange, intense, spiritual intimacy that had never existed before. The barrier between the priest and the person vanished, leaving only the raw human connection. Yet the horror cannot be romanticized away. We watch as the husband finally succumbs to the exhaustion and the infection. He collapses into the chair, the telltale throb beginning in his own neck. The house becomes a tomb. There will be no funeral procession. No bells will ring. The bell ringers are dead. And the ordinances have forbidden the tolling because it terrifies the survivors. There will be no mass. Their bodies will likely be carried out at night by corpse bearers. Men paid high wages to do the unthinkable and thrown into a plague pit, a mass grave where the noble and the peasant lie entangled in a final democratic embrace. This reality shattered the courtly love fantasy forever. How can you write poems about the sweet pain of distance when you have seen the real pain of the bubo? How can you worship a distant, idealized lady when you have seen the human body decompose in real time? The artistic response to the plague was the danse macabre, the dance of death. We see it painted on church walls, skeletons dancing with kings, knights, and beautiful maidens, grinning as they lead them to the grave. It was a visual reminder that beauty fades, wealth is useless, and the only certainty is the end. It injected a streak of cynicism and urgency into romance. The mood shifted from, "I will wait for you forever," to, "We must love now. For tomorrow, we might be black and cold. But let us look at the survivor. Let's say, against all odds, the wife recovers. The bubo bursts, the fever breaks, and she wakes up weak, thirsty, and alone. She looks around the silent room. Her husband is gone. Her children are gone. The world she knew has been erased. The silence outside is no longer terrifying. It is merely empty. She stands up, her legs trembling. She walks to the window and pushes open the shutter. The air is fresh again. The birds are returning. She is a widow. In the pre-plague world, this might have been a precarious existence, but the filthy truth of the post-plague world is shocking. It is an economic boom time for the survivors. The labor supply has been cut in half. Land is plentiful because the owners are dead. Wages are skyrocketing. And this woman, this survivor, is suddenly a very different legal entity. She has inherited her husband's business. She has the rights to the land. The strictures of coverture have evaporated with his death. She is about to enter a phase of life that is paradoxically freer than anything she experienced as a maiden or a wife. The plague has taken everything from her, but it has given her back herself. She is no longer a daughter to be traded or a wife to be commanded. She is a woman of means, a woman of experience, and a woman who has looked death in the face and blinked. As she washes her face in the basin, scrubbing away the sweat of the sickness, she is not just washing away the past. She is preparing for a future that is radically different. She steps out of the house into the sunlight that feels too bright for her tired eyes. She sees other survivors emerging like ghosts from their doors. They look at each other with a shared, haunted understanding. They are the remnant, and among them, new sparks will eventually fly. But this time, the love will be different. It will be faster, harder, and perhaps a bit more mercenary, because everyone knows now how quickly it can end. We follow this widow as she walks towards the market square, which is slowly, tentatively coming back to life. She is not looking for a protector. She is looking for a partner. Or perhaps she is looking for something else entirely. We are about to discover the dangerous, powerful freedom of the medieval widow, the woman who realized that the end of a marriage could mean the beginning of a life. The church bell tolls, a lonely iron sound that vibrates through the soles of the feet. The plague pits have been covered over with lime and fresh earth, and the grass is already reclaiming the scars of the disaster. From this soil, a new figure rises, one of the most powerful and feared characters in the medieval drama, the widow. We watch her walk down the high street. She is not the weeping, broken creature the poets describe. She walks with a heavy, purposeful stride, her keys jangling at her belt like a weapon. Those keys are the symbol of the filthy truth we are uncovering tonight. In a society built on the oppression of women, the only way to be truly free was to outlive your oppressor. For a woman in the Middle Ages, the death of a husband was a tragedy, yes. It meant grief, instability, and fear. But once the tears dried, it also meant a sudden, blinding legal resurrection. We spoke earlier of coverture, the legal fiction that a wife was merely an extension of her husband. Now, that spell is broken. The widow is femme sole, a woman alone. In the eyes of the law, she has suddenly become a person. She can own property in her own name. She can sign contracts. She can sue her debtors. She can run a business. She has inherited her husband's workshop, his tools, his trade connections, and often a third to a half of his entire estate. She is, quite suddenly, a CEO in a wimple. This terrified the medieval male establishment. A woman with money and no master was a loose cannon on the deck of the social ship. The literature of the time is filled with vicious satires of the lusty widow, a voracious, uncontrollable creature who uses her independence to satisfy her insatiable sexual appetite. The most famous example is Chaucer's Wife of Bath, a gap-toothed, bold-faced woman who has buried 5 husbands and is cheerfully looking for a 6th. She is a caricature, drawn by men who were deeply insecure about what women might do if they weren't being constantly policed. But like all caricatures, she is drawn from a grain of truth. The widow was dangerous because she was experienced. The innocent bride of Section 2 could be molded, intimidated, and controlled. She knew nothing of the world or the bedroom. The widow, however, knew exactly how the world worked. She knew the value of a coin. She knew how to negotiate a contract. And perhaps most terrifyingly to the church, she knew what happened between the sheets. She could not be lied to about pleasure. If she took a lover, it was because she wanted one, not because she was ordered to. This autonomy turned the sexual hierarchy upside down. The church preached that women were the weaker vessel, prone to sin. A rich widow with a wandering eye was the ultimate proof of their anxiety. We see our widow in the marketplace, but she is no longer hiding in the shadows, buying love potions. She is standing behind the counter of a brewery. Brewing was traditionally women's work. Alewives were the backbone of the medieval beverage industry. But as a widow, she owns the vat. She bargains with the grain merchant, looking him in the eye, haggling him down to a price that makes him sweat. She counts her coins into a heavy leather purse. She is competent, sharp, and formidable. She doesn't need a knight to save her. She can buy her own protection. But this freedom comes with a new kind of predation. She is now the hunted. In the wake of the plague, with social mobility accelerating, a rich widow is a prize target for fortune hunters. Younger sons of nobility, impoverished knights, and ambitious apprentices circle her like sharks. The dynamic of courtship flips entirely. It is no longer the older man buying the young girl. It is the young, handsome, penniless man trying to seduce the older, wealthy woman. The May December romance was a common medieval scandal, but often with the gender roles reversed. We see a young squire leaning on her counter, flashing a charming smile, praising her beauty. She listens, perhaps amused, perhaps flattered. But she is calculating. She knows he doesn't love her. He loves her brewery. The choice she faces is agonizing. If she remarries, she gains a protector and perhaps a lover, but she loses her freedom. The moment she says, "I do," the portcullis of coverture slams down again. Her new husband takes control of the brewery, the money, and her body. If he is a good man, she becomes a partner. If he is a tyrant or a fool, she loses everything she has built. Many widows looked at this bargain and said, "No." This brings us to one of the most fascinating hacks of the medieval system, the vow of chastity. We watch our widow enter the bishop's court, but not to confess a sin. She is here to take the mantle and ring. She kneels before the bishop and solemnly vows to never have sex again. This sounds like a surrender to the church's repressiveness. But look closer. It is a brilliant legal maneuver. By becoming a vowess, she places herself under the special protection of the church. No one can force her to marry. No king can order her to wed his favorite courtier to pay off a debt. She secures her permanent independence. She trades sex for sovereignty. She leaves the cathedral dressed in a russet gown, a ring on her finger that signifies she is a bride of Christ. But she doesn't go to a nunnery. She goes back to her house. She keeps her business. She keeps her friends. She keeps her rich foods and her warm fire. She lives in the world, but is no longer of it. At least, not the part of it that requires her to serve a man. It is a triumphant loophole. Of course, not every widow chose celibacy. Some enjoyed the lusty widow life, taking lovers quietly, discreetly, outside the bounds of marriage. Since she was no longer a virgin, the social penalty for a discreet affair was lower than for a maiden. As long as she didn't get pregnant, a risk that decreased with age, she could carve out a private life of affection that was entirely her own. We imagine her in the evening, sharing a cup of wine with a man she has chosen, perhaps a fellow guild member, perhaps a neighbor. They sit by the fire, two adults with scars and stories, finding comfort in each other without the pressure of dynastic duty. It is a mature, seasoned love. It is not the breathless, anxious love of the teenager. It is the comfortable, knowing love of the survivor. Yet, there is a shadow here. The filthy truth is that a woman alone was always suspect. If her business was too successful, neighbors might whisper about witchcraft. If she was too happy, the gossips might label her a harlot. The line between an independent woman and a scold or a witch was dangerously thin. The ducking stool, a chair used to dunk troublesome women into the river, was a tool of social control, often aimed at women who spoke too loudly or stepped too far out of line. Our widow walks a razor's edge. She must be tough enough to run her business, but humble enough to avoid the wrath of a community that dislikes an uppity woman. As night falls over the recovering city, the widow locks her own door. She slides the heavy iron bolt into place. It is a sound of finality and security. She is alone in her house. The silence is not lonely. It is luxurious. She sits at her table, dipping a quill into ink, and signs her own name to a ledger. That signature is a victory. In a world that wanted to trade her, breed her, and silence her, she has managed to carve out a space where she belongs only to herself. But as she blows out the candle, she wonders, is this enough? Safety is sweet, and autonomy is addictive, but the human heart is a social organ. We are not built to be islands. The Middle Ages was a time of collective living, and the femme soul is an anomaly. The journey we have taken, from the cold contract of the castle to the steam of the bathhouse, from the desperation of the potion to the grief of the plague, has shown us that love is often a trap. But it has also shown us that we cannot stop stepping into it. We have one final stop on this journey. We must look past the contracts, the laws, the diseases, and the cynical negotiations. We must find the ember in the ash. We must find the rare, impossible thing that the poets promised, but the historians rarely find. We are going to end our story not with a grand royal wedding, but with something much smaller and much more profound. We are going to find a love that survived the filth. The fire in the hearth has burned low, reducing the great logs of the evening to a bed of pulsing, deep red coals that breathe with the draught of the room. Outside, the snow has begun to fall, a thick, muffling blanket that seals the cottage, or perhaps the manor house. For in the end, the station matters less than the warmth from the freezing medieval night. We have traveled through the cold calculations of the contract room, the terrified whispers of the confessional, the sweaty desperation of the bathhouse, and the tragic silence of the plague pit. We have seen love bartered, policed, infected, and mourned. We have dismantled the shiny chivalric lie to expose the filthy truth of a world where survival was the only real religion. But as we reach the end of our journey, we must be careful not to fall into the trap of total cynicism. History is not just a record of cruelty. It is also a record of resilience. If love in the Middle Ages was a transaction, we must ask, was there ever any change left over? Was there ever a moment where the ledger was ignored? The answer, hidden in the margins of dusty manuscripts and the cracks of broken tombstones, is yes. We find it here, in this quiet room, with two elderly people asleep under a pile of heavy furs. Let us call them William and Margaret. They are the survivors. They have outlived the plague, the wars, the bad harvests, and the dangerous whims of kings. They are not the beautiful, smooth-skinned youths of the courtly romances. Their bodies are maps of their history. William's hands are gnarled with arthritis, the knuckles swollen like knots in an old oak tree, a testament to decades of gripping a sword or a plough. Margaret's back is bent, shaped by the weight of children carried and churns lifted. Their breath rattles slightly in their chests, a reminder of the winter coughs that never quite leave. They do not smell of rosewater. They smell of wood smoke, old wool, and the faint medicinal scent of camphor rub. It is the smell of endurance. This is the ember in the ash. It is the love that remains when the fire of youth has burned out. Historians like Philippe Ariès once famously argued that love as we know it, the emotional, child-centric, affectionate bond, was a modern invention, that medieval people were too busy dying to care deeply. But modern scholarship, fueled by the discovery of private letters, has largely dismantled this cold view. We look to the Boston Letters, a treasure trove of correspondence from a 15th century Norfolk family. In them, we find Marjorie Paston writing to her husband, John, calling him her right well-beloved Valentine. She worries about his health. She asks him to buy her a new sash, yes. But she also writes, "I had rather have you there than a new gown, though it were of scarlet." In a world where a scarlet gown was worth a year's wages, that is not a trivial statement. It is a declaration of value. It is the filthy truth redeeming itself, the realization that the person is worth more than the property. William and Margaret have reached this state not through poetry, but through friction. They have worn each other smooth, like two stones in a river. They know each other's darkest secrets. Margaret knows that William is terrified of thunder. William knows that Margaret weeps every year on the anniversary of the child they lost in the great mortality. There is no need for masks here. The chivalric code, with its pedestals and elaborate games, was for strangers. This comfortable, grunting, unglamorous proximity is for partners. They sleep back to back, a position of mutual defense and shared warmth. In a room where the temperature will drop below freezing before dawn, their bodies are the only furnace that matters. This is the biological reality of love. Thermoregulation. It is the comfort of a cold foot tucked between warm calves. It is the hand reaching out in the darkness to check if the other is still breathing. It is a love that has shed the vanity of the mirror and the greed of the market. It is simply the relief of not being alone in the dark. We often pity the people of the Middle Ages for their lack of dentistry, their lack of democracy, and their lack of antibiotics. And rightfully so. It was a hard, painful time to be alive. But in this specific quietude, we might envy them just a little. Their world was quieter. There were no buzzing notifications, no electric hums, no global anxieties pressing into the bedroom. When the sun went down, the world stopped. The darkness was absolute. And in that void, the presence of another human being was profound. The medieval filthy truth is that love was not a luxury item, like a tapestry or a spice. It was a utility. It was the wooden beam that kept the roof from collapsing. It was the salt that kept the meat from rotting. It was essential, as the last log in the fire breaks apart, sending a shower of orange sparks drifting up the chimney to join the stars. We understand finally that the romance of the Middle Ages was not in the joust, or the tower, or the potion. It was here. It was in the stubborn refusal to let go. It was in the courage to plant a seed in the spring, knowing the frost might kill it. It was in the act of washing a body that would eventually decay. It was in the defiant act of loving someone in a world that was constantly trying to kill you. William and Margaret drift deeper into sleep, their breathing sinking into a slow, rhythmic harmony that sounds like the ocean, or like time itself. They have won. They have stolen this moment of peace from history. And as we, the invisible ghosts, back slowly away from their bedside, leaving them to their well-earned rest, we carry with us the final truth. Love is not about the rose. It is about the root. It is dirty. It is hidden in the earth. And it is the only thing that holds the ground when the storm comes. The fire is just a glow now, a soft, pulsing heart in the center of the room. The shadows have stopped dancing and have settled into the corners, wrapping the world in a cloak of velvet gray. The centuries are drifting back into place, sealing over the cracks we have peered through. The noise of the market, the clatter of the armor, and the scratch of the quill have all faded into the deep, welcoming silence of the night. You are no longer in the cold stone keep, nor the muddy street. You are safe in your own time, in your own bed, suspended in the warm, soft space between waking and sleeping. The history is done. The struggle is over. There is nothing left to learn tonight, nothing left to analyze, nothing left to fear. There is only the quiet, the warmth, and the steady, comforting rhythm of your own breathing. Let the stories dissolve like mist. Let the heavy curtain of sleep fall gently, blocking out the light, blocking out the worry. You are the ember in the ash now, warm, safe, and at rest. Sweet dreams.